And so what I've built for you is a world map that kind of has some acupuncture or pinpoints of where we're seeing the effects of climate change in a very real way. So I'd like to take you through that. So everywhere you see an E, and I use E here for environmental, economic, experiential, and equity misalignments. If you remember our shear zones, so I'm using whenever you see an E, you'll see that there's probably some sort of shear zone problem in the quadruple bottom line. So here's the map. And by the way, you're free to come in. I'll be giving you the link to this. You're free to come in and browse around here and watch some of the movies if you'd like. And starting in Australia, for example, the ozone hole, it's actually improved a bit, but people in Australia have been directly impacted by the hole in the ozone, and generally speaking, wear sunblock all the time now and dress in a very covered way. As you know, Australia, and sorry for the typo there, Australia has received record floods in the last 4 straight years, and also record summer heat at the same time. So they tend to get the effects of climate change a lot more quickly than some other places in the world. Sea level rise is in many places, but in India, Bangladesh especially, you're seeing impacts of sea level rise, islands disappearing, populations relocating, and that's some of the impacts. And zooming back out to the world here, you see all kinds of E's everywhere. Zooming back into the US, the idea or the act of coal burning is, and these red lines, by the way, these are emissions back into the atmosphere. These are CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions back into the atmosphere. And so every time we burn coal, we put CO2 into that. We also have acid rain that goes out into the lakes nearby, and we discussed in the other lectures the safety and death impacts of the, say, Massey coal mine explosion, for example. The environmental degradation and impact on local communities is quite intense. So I would say that the coal industry is a shear zone of misalignment of values, and we're seeing that in terms of the way that the world is being impacted. And certainly in China, for example, which has adopted coal now as a primary energy source for its industrial revolution, is seeing traumatic effects, traumatic rise in comfort and quality of life in one sense, in that more energy is cheaper than ever. But and we see here that China, for example, is ramping up its gigawatts of coal power dramatically over the next few years. So the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutive emissions are only increasing, and the effects of that are, yeah, we have quality of life in the sense that we have more energy to watch TV or be more cool or more warm, but the actual atmosphere in China is under severe distress from this, and you saw this in some of the lectures earlier on coal, that in some cities in China they had to erect giant video monitors to recreate the experience of what a sunrise might actually look like. This looks like a dystopian future, and yet this is taken this year. I'm also concerned about particulate matter 2.5, which is ultra tiny particulates that come with coal and other fossil fuel burning that actually create massive epidemics of respiratory illness, and that's why you saw the people wearing those masks. Those masks actually those masks will never be fine enough to block PM 2.5. So as we pursue these fossil fuels, we're looking at major health impacts. We're also seeing, for example, lots of biodiversity imbalances around the world from warmer weather. These are, if you can't tell, these are jellyfish, giant jellyfish in the Bay of Japan, where the fishing industry has been dramatically impacted in a negative way in terms of the jellyfish proliferating. And we're seeing that in invasive species all over the world, plants that do very well in high carbon atmospheres, and then species also that do very well, which is creating problems for livelihood for people. So that would be an equity shear zone. Certainly, unfortunately, the nuclear accident at Fukushima reminds us of the risk of death and the safety precautions here that are taken. And as we talked about in earlier lectures, that this caused Germany to discontinue their nuclear program. So we see these kinds of things happening around the world. Zooming in here to the Russian tundra, and here we can start to talk about emissions going into the atmosphere, but also a feedback loop. So as emissions get into the atmosphere, temperature warms, and as temperature warms, it feeds back into the natural environment, and places like the Russian tundra in Siberia begin to melt. And the problem there is that there is millions of years of peat or methane stored in the tundra there that gets released back into the atmosphere. Methane is about a 20 times more potent gas than CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas performance. And what's happening is, so you get a loop here. So as this melts, more emissions go in. As the temperature rises, it makes this melt more. And what we worry about is a point of no return, where the feedback loops and the amplification of these natural systems goes beyond a point when humans can adapt or certainly can do anything about. And just zooming out a little bit more here, we're also seeing really significant melting of glaciers. And you say, well, who cares if a few glaciers melt? Well, if you look at the map here, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit, the Himalayas actually service parts of Asia, parts of India, parts of Eastern Europe. The glaciers in the Himalayas are a huge part of the water source for actually millions, if not billions of people. So if we start to look at all of these things together, we start to worry that, And then you also have to remember that, for example, this is another feedback loop. As the snow melts, this usually would reflect heat back into the atmosphere. Here now the Earth just absorbed that heat, which eventually causes more warming. So we have a real problem there for people. And we see this most clearly at Kilimanjaro, which is actually feeds water to Kenya and many other African countries, and now we're seeing that the ice caps are really almost completely disappeared on Kilimanjaro. It's a very significant situation. And even in the US and Canada, the Glacier National Park actually is lost half of its glaciers and are about to lose half more in the next 25 years. So the evidence is all around us that this climate change system or event is really not something that's insignificant or shouldn't be taken lightly. It's actually a pretty serious situation. And certainly we're always looking at oil and the burning of oil as a CO2 emissions opportunity. We continue to look at the geopolitical aspects of oil, and the E here is really about social equity and environment, and what that means for that. And then let's see, I don't really want to watch, this was a very long movie, but here I want to talk about the Canadian tar sands. The CO2 emissions and the deforestation that comes from this are really critically impacting the global ecosystem because of the amount of emissions and the amount of deforestation. Remember, trees play an important role in the overall balance of Earth's ecosystem. And so the other thing I want to say here is that the tar sands generate what we call, I guess the only term I can think of is dirty oil, or very hard to process oil. And so the emissions are much higher, and the damage to the landscape. And I showed you in an earlier lecture on this that you need 2 tons of soil to generate 1 barrel of oil. So the amount of land that's being cleared and deforested and the impact to local tribes is really quite tremendous. I'll have this video and others posted up in the course sites, so you can look at that. We're also seeing record droughts in places like California, for example. So the Sierra Nevada, which has normally a very good snowpack in the winter, has lost 80% of its snowpack in 2014. Most of California and Nevada rely on the Sierra Nevada snowpacks for their drinking water, and so we're beginning to see really serious impacts of climate change. And we see the same thing in Africa and other countries where the same condition is occurring. We're also concerned about deforestation, not just because of the loss of the trees and the opportunity to find new medicines and the devastation of the rainforest. We're concerned about loss of biodiversity, but we also know that all of those trees and plants that have been growing down in South America are sequestering carbon, meaning that they have taken in carbon and sequestered it in their trunks of their trees, etc. So when we burn those forests, not only are we losing the value of those trees to the larger global ecosystem, but we're releasing all of that carbon right back out into the atmosphere, which is intensifying global warming and climate change. And so we also know that the loss of habitat and the threats to indigenous communities is quite high. And I'm not going to show it to you right now, but this video talks about a new dam system that's proposed for the Amazon rainforest that would create energy for the smelting industries of iron and copper and other metals. And the climate change impacts are significant because when you build a dam, you create situations where methane will release from these lakes because of all the dead vegetative material that was flooded over. So we have quite a situation in South America occurring. So as you watch this video, you realize that Our demand for comfort and affluence in this country and other countries for that matter is driving in part the burning of the rainforest to create grazing territory for beef. Most people love to eat beef. It's high protein, it's high quality food on one level. However, the amount of impact that's necessary to the amount of impact that's generated from raising beef is really quite high. So we always have to look at our affluence as a relationship in the sequence here. And certainly New Orleans in the U.S. and the Gulf is one of those pressure points or shear zones that we talk about, where we've seen really intense flooding and hurricanes over the years. And one thing that we know is that the oil industry is prevalent in the Gulf here, which means lots of opportunities for really bad spills, like the BP oil spill, which we covered, but also the fact that they've cut up all of the shipping lanes around the barrier islands of the Gulf of Mexico. And what's happened is the hurricanes now can come up onto New Orleans without much barrier. So, and we also see, because of climate change, lots of freshwater bodies really have their ecosystems change dramatically. So that's really a pressure point in the U.S. that we see. So we're getting near the end here, I believe. Oh, well, we're almost at the end. And of course, we talked about empathy across different scales of humanity and time, but we also talked about empathy for nature and for biodiversity and for animals. And we tend to have a particular affinity with polar bears. So obviously I cherry picked this little picture here to cause us to be worried about the polar bear. But these polar bears and other species like this, if they go extinct, it tells us that there's some sort of change in the ecosystem that's significant. And in this case, less ice for them to walk on, more swimming, makes them more tired, makes it more difficult for them to hunt. And these are really interesting diagrams that I look at of the spiral of Arctic sea ice volume. So from year to year, you see it getting lower and lower, and it will just eventually disappear. And the shipping lanes will open, and we'll have access to all kinds of new oil reserves. Not sure what that is. That's a little bit more about the Arctic sea ice. And people will tell you, yeah, but don't worry, the Antarctic sea ice is growing. And that is true in some parts of the Antarctic, but in most parts, large icebergs are breaking off. So the general trend is towards loss of ice. This is a little exhausting thinking about all these kind of things here. And the one thing I wanted to wrap up with here that I think is kind of important, and this is the one movie I'm going to show you, is there is a real connection between our actions as humans and the kinds of ways that we use materials and the way that we pollute. And this is called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is, for whatever reason, the currents of the ocean, all of the plastics and non-biodegradable materials are now confluenced in these giant spirals of waste. And what's happening is the animals in the Pacific are eating all of the plastic along with other food, and it's creating a severe impact on the ecosystem. That there really is some urgency that we as society and as humanity, as individuals, begin to take action. And the second half of this course is geared towards trying to figure out ways that, okay, so there it was. Okay, so we got it. Trying to figure out ways that we can, as designers, engineers, architects, how can we begin to do our part in trying to address so many myriad problems that we see in the earth, and try to acknowledge the fact that urgency is really there. So I hope you enjoyed Learning Module 4.0. I know it was long. We covered energy, we covered environment. When we come back for Learning Module 5 next week, we're really going to be stopping to talk about the environment and all the horrible things, and really starting to talk about ways that we can directly address these problems through our practices and our behavior. So thanks for watching. Take care.